So before we start this plenary, obviously Svenja couldn't thank herself because that would look very weird, but I think it is very much worth acknowledging that if you have felt like this conference is a bit smoother than normal, if there was less chaos, less people running around and screaming, a large part of that is because of the hard work that Svenja has put in during these 4 days. And I've told her that she can't do it again. And if she does, I'll just stop her because she needs to write. Okay, so with that done, I'm now really pleased to introduce us to the final closing plenary of this year's HM, which is Marxist strategies at the end of the liberal order. So we're going to have 4 excellent speakers speaking for around 18 minutes each in the following order. Firstly will be David McNally, who teaches history at the University of Houston. He's the editor of the journal Spectre, and he has a recent book, Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. And obviously, when I say someone has a book, buy the book. That is implicit, if not said directly. Then Alex Stoffel, who's a member of the editorial board, as well as a lecturer at Queen Mary, and he also has a book, Eros and Empire. Following Alex, we'll have Houria Bouteldja, who I had practiced saying her name properly, but then my brain, it fuzzled. And she, wait, my notes are just there. I knew this would happen, I apologize. So she's active in the Quartier General de Canaria website. She's an active member of the New Journal and the Parole d'Honneur, and she has a book, Rednecks and Barbarians Uniting the White and Racialized Working Class. David Schulman, wherever you are, there, has many of them in a box to sell you, again. And finally, Katy Fox-Hodess. She's a senior lecturer in employment at the Sheffield Centre for Decent Work. And I think we are ready to begin. So, David, if you want to get us started.
All right, comrades, this will be interesting to see whether I can actually multitask as I speak to you and try to show you some slides. But let me start by echoing the shout out to the Historical Materialism Editorial Board and the Conference Organizing Committee and all the volunteers. Take a look around this room. This is phenomenal. And it is only possible because of incredibly dedicated efforts of the editors, the organizers, the volunteers, and so on. So from the bottom of my heart, a big shout out to all of them for making this possible. I'm going to be speaking largely about the United States, not because I'm American, I'm actually a foreigner inside the United States where I'm living and working at the moment, but because I don't think it's a secret to say that any discussion of fighting the global right has to try to come to terms with the state of the struggle and the movement inside the United States. And I'm going to begin by posing one of the problems that we confront. It came up briefly in last night's discussion, and it is this, that if we are living in a situation in which there are elements of, ingredients of, aspects of a process of fascization, then why? Because classically we say, to quote Walter Benjamin, behind every fascism there is a failed revolution. And I think we're probably going to agree that we have not come through a failed revolution in the United States. And yet, I think that's too simple, because I'm going to suggest to you that the far right, MAGA, all of the forces that have congealed around Trumpism and the new right in the United States believe they dodged a failed revolution. And I want to speak about the significance of that and try to draw a few strategic conclusions. Because the political unconscious of the far right in the United States is a haunted one. And I'm going to take you to this indirectly. Indeed, you may find where I begin slightly bizarre. Comrades, I offer you gay race communism. Now, this may sound, I agree, by the way, with the shout out. I've been trying to figure out where we sign up. But I offer you this because this graphic sent MAGA world wild for over a week. President Trump waged into the debate. Their whole media ecosystem was dominated by denunciation of this graphic. When the Cracker Barrel chain had redesigned its logo, and yes, Sean Davis, CEO of The Federalist, a pretty significant right-wing website, argued here that we are witnessing a striking manifestation of gay race communism. By the way, I really think our graphic artists could do better than this, but I want you to stay with me on this for a moment. There's the previous logo. MAGA world erupted because they took out the barrel and the cracker. But why? Because this imagery is essential to a series of myths and lies that they must propagate because the far right is angry and paranoid for a reason. And it's important to emphasize this because many, many comrades outside the United States often miss the subtext to these texts. I say this with great conviction because I was exposed to an assault by MAGA World in July, which went on for about a week. And what I'm about to say to you draws directly from that experience. What is this meant to hide? That's precinct number 3 in Minneapolis, police precinct number 3 on the night of May 26, 27, 2020, as it went up in flames in the first 48 hours of the George Floyd uprising. This event, in all of its magnitude, has left a deep, deep psychic scar on the far right in the United States, precisely because they do not believe they've yet defeated it. And this is important, and it's going to be particularly important when we begin to turn to questions of strategy. That's a close-up of the young people in front of the 3rd precinct as it burns. This was a traumatic experience for them. When you hear the attacks on critical race theory, when you hear the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, don't fall for the immediate targets alone. Understand that this is what drives that assault. They are convinced that they need to root out the very possibility of this kind of insurgent upheaval inside the United States. So I want to just take a couple of minutes and talk about this. I'm going to show you one more picture from that uprising, because this was not Minneapolis alone. The best study we have suggested about 26 million people participated in the thousands of protests that went on for weeks as part of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter uprising. It was young, it was multiracial, it was Black-led, There were so many young queer and trans activists. It was overwhelmingly driven forward by the organizing efforts of Black women. It was the most multiracial rebellion against racism so far in the history of the United States. There's Houston, where I've been living and working. Now, this was a demonstration of 60,000, and I will tell you personally that the first demonstration I ever joined as a 16-year-old against the war in Vietnam, yeah, I'm that old, as a teenager against the war in Vietnam, we were attacked by mounted police on horseback. When horses come at you, it's frightening. Now imagine the situation when they're on our side. When tens of thousands gather and dozens of Black cowboys, fists in the air, ride into downtown Houston as part of seizing the center of the city for a matter of hours as part of this uprising. So it's not just Minneapolis. At its peak, there were on average 140 different protest actions a day in the United States, often mobilizing as many as 500,000 people in a single 24-hour period. For the far right, this is our failed revolution. We may know that we were nowhere close. We weren't. We were nowhere close to a revolutionary situation. But in their political unconscious, this is what Cracker Barrel is all about. This is why the barrel and the old cracker need to be centered. And as a result, what we have been witnessing is their attempt to enact what Herbert Marcuse and Angela Davis described in the 1970s as a preventive counter-revolution. They are determined to make sure that this kind of opposition cannot reemerge. And I need to say as a sidebar, remember that all of this then culminated in a wave of strikes by athletes. And at that moment, when the movement was shifting towards strike action, because let's be clear, once basketball players and football players and baseball players start walking out, it's bound to have an infectious character. How long was it before hospitality workers, teachers, nurses, and so on were also going to begin to walk out in their protest actions? And do not forget that the individual sent in to meet with the athletes and stop the strikes was Barack Obama. Obama was used for precisely that purpose. So it's in this context that I then want to say a few words about the phenomenon of social ignorance and social stupidity, because it's true that there's an just extraordinary ignorance and stupidity when you get MAGA world going ballistic over Cracker Barrel logos. But I want to remind you, because this is incredibly important theoretical and political legacy for us, and it is an argument that W.E.B. Du Bois initially makes in Black Reconstruction in America, and James Baldwin, who I'll turn to in a moment, picks up. Because Du Bois tells us in Black Reconstruction that the United States has, quote, suffered spiritually for the prevalence of racism, for its histories of slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow, all of which, Du Bois says, rest upon, quote, deliberate lying, unquote. And he argues correctly, in my view, that this breeds an infantilism, quote, unworthy of growing folks, unquote. Yeah. Unworthy of growing folks. In short, racism US style stupefies its participants, produces a social ignorance which becomes widespread. And Baldwin really takes this up when, in his essay on being white, he says that critically, racism debases white people, white racists debase and defame themselves, he says, and then says, but this cowardice, this necessity of justifying a totally false identity and of justifying what must be called a genocidal history has placed everyone now living into the hands of the most ignorant and powerful people the world has ever known. Yeah, I know, 1984 was pretty prescient because they get even more ignorant and powerful as time goes on. But it's critical to understand that it is not simply a dumbing down of a political culture. It is every racist re-entrenchment pivots on and requires the kind of social ignorance and the hollowing out of meaningful political discourse. Now, I've been talking about the George Floyd uprising, but I don't want you to think that all of these ingredients are only something of 5.5 years ago. So I want to spend a moment talking to you about the anti-ICE mobilizations that we're seeing in major US cities now, like Chicago and LA. And you'll see in the background of the photo, the armored vehicles, the National Guard, and so on. These comrades who are holding the line against ICE are fully aware of what's behind them. And yet the mobilizations that have happened against ICE in the United States are truly among the most courageous mobilizations we've seen in many, many years. I'm going to briefly quote to you from Maga Miranda's description of the LA rebellion against ICE in June. This is, okay, I'm going to tell you that Maga Miranda has a terrific piece in Spectre on all of this, and you can look it up because I need now to move to the strategic conclusions. Thank you, Rob. I'm going to make the case for two indispensable strategic legacies, without which I believe that the left in the United States and globally cannot properly address the challenges of the moment. This passage I'm going to read you from C.L.R. James is not unique in one respect. It came out of a legacy of communist organizing against racism in the United States, but the Communist Party, notwithstanding some excellent work around things like the Scottsboro Boy campaign, tenant struggles in Harlem, and so on, always regressed on the question of race and class in the United States. C.L.R. James, as part of what was then the American Socialist Workers' Party, wrote this key document in 1948 called The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the United States. I am henceforth going to update the language. James writes in this document, we say, number one, that the Black struggle, the independent Black struggle, has a vitality and a validity of its own, that it has deep historic roots in the past of America and in present struggles. We say, number two, that this independent Black movement is able to intervene with terrific force upon the general social and political life of the nation, despite the fact that it is waged under the banner of democratic rights and not necessarily led either by organized labor or a Marxist party. We say, number three, and this is the most important, that it is able to exercise a powerful influence upon the revolutionary proletariat, that it has got a real contribution to make to the development of the working class in the United States, and that it is in itself a constituent part of the struggle for socialism. Now, some of you who have followed debates in the United States will know that what I've just quoted is highly contentious, that there is a so-called class reductionist debate in the United States. By the way, I don't think it's class reductionism, because I think if you make up a class that doesn't have racial composition, gender composition, and so on. You created a fiction. But the point is, this claim for the strategic centrality of an independent Black movement in the United States is an absolutely indispensable heritage, because unless you understand that, when the next George Floyd rebellion comes, and it's only a question of when, it's not a question of if, in the United States, there is a danger that the left once again will fail to fully consolidate the possibilities. I also want to say that this legacy of Ella Baker, the key, you can see the words, the strategist at the bottom. Ella Baker was the strategist of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She came out of both Southern Black radicalism and Harlem-based left labor radicalism. And she brought a new model that challenged the dominant model in the civil rights movement with the creation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1960. And Baker, she had her class critique of the civil rights movement. She believed it was much too middle class in composition and leadership at the time, too focused on charismatic leadership. But most importantly, Ella Baker argued that the movement needed an organizing model and not simply a mobilizing model. And this is a lesson, by the way, that I think has wide application. It is one thing for us to bring out 100,000 people in the struggle against the genocide in Palestine. Hugely important to mobilize. But what about the organizing? What about the networks in workplaces, unions, communities, schools? And Ella Baker's fundamental claim was that every campaign has failed unless the organizers have trained new organizers, people who can build a struggle. And this legacy is going to be something indispensable to reclaim if the left in the United States is going to be able to prepare itself for new waves of uprising and new waves of struggle. I'm going to conclude, because I know Rob's going to wave some sign at me momentarily. I'm going to conclude by a glimpse back that I think is also a glimpse forward. These young women, these teenagers, 14 to 16 years old, there was one more of them, met online in Nashville, Tennessee during the George Floyd uprising. They'd never met one another in real life, and they agreed that they would organize a protest. 10,000 people came out in Nashville based on an initiative that these young women who had never attended a protest before, never organized anything before, brought together. And yet, we left what my dear friend Alan Sears calls no infrastructures of dissent behind with these people. These people are the reason. That is what the Cracker Barrel debate is about. It is about hiding and denying this reality of American society, that there are millions of people who can be brought around a fighting, anti-racist, working class politics. But it's going to be one that has to foreground anti-racism and the organizing, not just the mobilizing model. There will be more of these people in the years ahead. And we want to make sure, we have an obligation to make sure that they become part of real, organized political movements, campaigns, and organizations, because they're out there. And the left can't afford to fail them again. Thank you.
Should I? Okay.
Yeah. Do we have that connecting back? Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Okay, hi guys. Thanks, Rob. When an individual is denied the recognition of their gender, or the right to determine their own sex, or the freedom to openly love another person, they often experience that denial as commensurate with the hardships of hunger, poverty, and overwork. In fact, for many proletarianized queer and trans people, the effacement of their gender and sexuality can become the immediate cause of their material deprivation. Still, when they have raised concerns related to identity, recognition, and bodily autonomy, these concerns have historically been dismissed as secondary matters at best, bourgeois deviations at worst. There is still, on the left, a durable presumption of a hierarchy between primary material needs and secondary immaterial needs. Fascists, meanwhile, do not deny the libidinal aspects of human life. Instead of offering their followers material advantages, they invite them to relish in the immaterial pleasures involved in purging the national body of its impurities. The far right promises its adherents the right to participate with impunity in the destructive reconstruction of a body politic that is founded upon a restored hierarchy of human value. This promise appeals to fantasies of superiority that can only be realized through humiliation and domination. Fascism's aspirational ideals therefore elicit the pleasures of violence from those tasked with their implementation. As the far right accuses a culture of wokeness of robbing the public of the simple pleasures of humor and language, it clears the path for the circulation of its own cruelties. Social media users gleefully broadcast spectacles of violence to millions of users online. IOF soldiers revel in the cross-dressing and exhibitionism when they dress themselves in the lingerie of the Palestinian women they have dispossessed or murdered. Incels seek to reclaim the archaic right to sex with women through the legalization of rape. Tradwives traffic in the happily ever after of a future where normative white womanhood is secured against the ostensible threats of gender ideology and transness. And in the manosphere, men get to live out fantasies of independence and patriarchal power. Both tradwives and men's rights activists sell the gender euphoria to their audiences that they so ardently deny trans people. What is striking about all of these examples is that they speak to the concerns of embodiment and of sexuality. What the far right's preoccupation with fertility, sexlessness, bodily fitness, gender identification, vaccinations, autism diagnoses, nutritional standards, loneliness epidemics, and so on shows is that fascism directs immense psychic and social energies towards the most intimate domains of our lives. As Foucault memorably wrote in The History of Sexuality about half a century ago, the body is an especially dense transfer point for relations of power. When transmitted through the terrain of the body and sexuality, fascistic desires are imbued with erotic, often even pornographic intensity. Just as fascism presupposes and vows to uphold the proper distinctions between public and private, so too does it grant its followers the power to transgress those distinctions. Fascism affords participation in a frenzied scrambling of rules, norms, and laws for the putative renewal of a disciplined and rigidly hierarchized social order. Commentators therefore insist that fascism cannot be reduced to repression, respectability, and restraint. Its erotic charge lies rather in the exhilarating power to transgress the proper demarcations of social life, even as that transgressive power resubmits its followers to the ever more punitive powers of family, state, and capital. Now, it would be tempting to make sense of this fascist erotics of transgression through a traditional psychoanalytic frame that views its followers as compensated for their submission to the state and capital with the authorization to indulge certain innate needs, impulses, drives, and desires. According to this popular Freudian model, human beings contain an inner core of natural impulses that must be controlled through reason, and within fascistic societies, the rational control of these destructive impulses is dissolved, and so they can be easily manipulated by fascist leaders. But this psychoanalytic model treats human impulses, passions, and desires as belonging to an ahistorical, pre-social nature. A materialist and a historical analysis would treat the fascist erotics of transgression not as the desublimation of innate drives, but as the expression of deteriorating social relations. A central tenet of historical materialism is, after all, that all human needs, wants, and desires are socially mediated. We can only meet our needs within and through the particular social relations of production and distribution into which we are born. As we produce the means to satisfy our needs, so too do we create new needs, and as we create new needs, so too do the parameters of what counts as a need change. One major challenge for historical materialists is to account for how social mediation under capitalism produces the impression of sex, gender, and the body as the most private and natural of things, so that we fail to regard them as themselves mediated by history and society. So, let's do some Marxism. Under capitalist social relations, human desires and needs are not satisfied as ends in themselves, but rather only insofar as they coincide with the accumulation of capital. The social production of the means to satisfy human needs takes the alienated form of the production of commodities. And these commodities are produced not as use values to satisfy needs, but as values to make money. Bourgeois economists tell us that production under capitalism will naturally adjust itself to the limits of the market, and that market is understood as a neutral mechanism for gathering and transmitting information about what and how much is needed by whom and where. But as Marxists, we know that capitalist production does not adjust itself to the market, because its purpose is not the satisfaction of consumption needs, but rather the accumulation of profit. Capitalist production treats market demand not as a fixed limit, but rather as an inconvenience to be overcome. In order to surmount the barriers set by market demand, capitalists set a portion of capital into motion in the sphere of circulation by investing in retailing, advertising, market research, public relations, and so on, endlessly fabricating new needs to facilitate the realization of values. Capitalism hierarchizes the capacity to consume, so that vast swaths of humanity struggle to meet the basic conditions for survival, while a global minority of workers are able to indulge in excessive consumption. This hierarchy produces a distinction between profitable and unprofitable human needs. Certain needs can be represented within the terms of value production. These profitable needs are the proportion of human needs that coincide with the generation of capitalist wealth. Unprofitable needs are all those needs that are not covered by a wage and can only be met, if they're met at all, outside the immediate circuits of capital. The unwaged activities that are carried out to satisfy those needs that can't be met profitably, like the majority of care for children, the elderly, the disabled, and so on, constitute the feminized reproductive sphere. These activities form the vast majority of life-sustaining activity, yet are not productive as they're not socially validated by a wage. They are perhaps arguably the most valuable activities for the satisfaction of human wants and needs, yet capital struggles to make them count in the terms of capitalist wealth. Even when reproductive activities are commodified, the low productivity rates in the waged reproductive sector, compared to other sectors, means that the work remains low-waged and precarious. For that reason, it falls on groups who are socially positioned as powerless, i.e., subjects of racial and gendered oppression. Capital seizes upon existing gender and racial stratifications in the population to make this distinction between profitable and unprofitable needs appear as the natural outcome of biological and cultural differences. The unprofitability of reproductive activity returns us to the question of embodiment and bodily life. 2 years ago, in his Deutscher Memorial lecture, Gabriel Weinand argued that the chronic underinvestment in reproductive systems, both public and private, is a result of the body's resistance to systematic commodification. The nature of embodiment, defined as the opacities and indeterminacies of interpersonal relationships, means that bodily life itself presents a limit to capital. The body impedes the forms of rationalization and homogenization that achieve higher levels of productivity and raise profits within the manufacturing sector, since the body can't be relied on to follow any exact protocol through the cycle of everyday life or across the stretch of a lifetime. If, as Judith Butler has argued, fascists find in the body a site for the condensation of multiple psychic and affective investments because the body is so bound up with relationality, vulnerability, agency, penetrability, sexuality, and passion, this complexity of bodily life is also precisely why the body struggles to comply with the necessary temporalities of capitalist production. In other words, since the body can't be fully subsumed under the abstract compulsions of capital, many of our distinct embodied needs are abandoned or ignored by capital and have to be met through unwaged reproductive activities instead. Those needs then appear as natural, unmediated, pre-social. Even though some reproductive activities have been commodified, low profit rates within the sector have led to the erosion of formal reproductive infrastructures, or what we colloquially term the crisis of care. That crisis has led to the formation of new informal configurations of reproduction worldwide. And as these alternatives have proliferated to satisfy unprofitable human needs, so too have they orchestrated new racialized and gendered forms of domination the world over. These crises of reproduction are internal to the capitalist system, arising from capital's relentless subordination of life-making activities to profit-making ones. As growth within post-industrial states stagnates and becomes increasingly dependent on the cheap labor of feminized and racialized immigrants within the service sector, the far right seeks to concentrate power in the hands of authoritarian states to mount a systemic intervention through carceral measures, policing, surveillance, deportation, criminalization, and coercion directed at the most vulnerable. In order to shore up support for this project, it stokes the libidinal energies of aggrieved groups through the permission to transgress norms, rules, and laws that are no longer perceived to be working. As a response to capitalism's production of deprivation and unmet need, fascism eroticizes domination and destruction, instrumentalizing the body as the scene of multiplying psychic and affective anxieties. Within this context, the task for the socialist left must be to provide compelling countervisions of human flourishing that take the messy realm of embodied passions, pleasures, and desires seriously. The unique contribution of queer and trans-feminist struggle to wider left struggle over the past 70 years has been to locate possibilities of erotic flourishing in the disillusion of the normative categories to which fascism clings for its meaning. Like fascism, the erotic appeal of queerness lies formally in the transgression of norms and boundaries concerning the distinct and differentiated life of the body, though crucially without the promise of restored tradition and civilizational greatness. Erotics is instead sought in the undoing of hierarchized classifications of human beings. As capitalist developments have dramatically reconfigured the organization of gender, sexuality, and the body over the past century, queer and trans-feminist movements have found within those reconfigurations imminent possibilities for the supersession of systems of deprivation. They have again and again built their struggles on the basis of erotic and bodily pleasures that stand in as a figure for the transformation of social relations as a whole. Gay liberationists, Black lesbian feminists, 8 activists, trans feminists today. I'm good. Less than 5 minutes, just like 1 minute. Queer and trans radicals have long understood that the abandonment and criminalization of bodily capacities, gender expressions, and sexualities belong to capitalism's drive towards fragmentation and isolation. Their erotic politics names the life-sustaining transgression of the violent classifications of gender, race, and sexuality, threatening to conjure a world where our embodied needs for autonomy, intimacy, sex, health, rest, shelter, food, and aesthetic experience become coordinates for social transformation. Queer and trans life is therefore not just life that is conditioned by the pathologization and neglect of embodied needs and desires. It is also a site for the negation of a system where human needs are only met when it serves the needs of accumulation. The political horizons of queer and trans life have created a vision of society beyond the association of rational subjects who have developed the proper capacity to civilize their messy human desires, toward the possibility of a society based on forms of mutuality and cooperation that are built to sustain the realization of our collective human needs. So to conclude, all naturalized rankings of human needs, inauthentic versus authentic, cultural versus economic, immaterial versus material, superficial versus real, They all ultimately culminate in a naturalized ordering of human beings. There is no natural hierarchy of needs. All needs are socially mediated. There is, however, a historically specific ordering of human needs under capitalism according to their representability within the terms of value production. Capital's movement produces an ordering of profitable versus unprofitable needs where, as the Wages Against Housework campaign had already understood decades ago, unprofitable needs cannot be fully absorbed within the purview of capital without abolishing the laws of capital as such. The challenge for socialists is therefore to envision the full socialization of our abilities towards the fulfillment of our collective needs, desires, and human potentials. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I hope to respect the 20 minutes. So I will start by getting straight to the point. In my opinion, there is no way to fight fascism today without challenging the main institution that not only provides all the conditions for the rise of fascism, but also acts as its accelerator. I am referring to the European Union. I told you straight to the point. As Fanon advised us more than 60 years ago, we must leave Europe. To this, I would add that there are two ways to live, reactionary or revolutionary. Needless to say, Brexit was a reactionary exit and is precisely the example not to follow. I therefore propose to consider a proposal based on the French case, which would be a left-wing, decolonial, and why not revolutionary exit. Over the last 20 years or so in France, we have seen the emergence of a new anti-racist political consciousness. We have moved from what is known as moral anti-racism, which is a version of state-promoted or Republican anti-racism, to political anti-racism. What defines moral anti-racism is that it designates the far right as the main enemy, and as a secondary enemy, individuals who most often come from white working class backgrounds because they don't like Black people or Muslims. According to moral anti-racists, these individuals need to be re-educated because they have a false consciousness that undermines their class consciousness. Political anti-racism totally rejects this conception of racism. For us, racism does not emanate from the far right, but from the modern capitalist, colonial, and imperialist state. According to this conception, not only is the far right not the place where racism is produced, but it is itself the product of what I call the integral racial state. Indeed, as David Goldberg teaches us with his concept of the racial state, all the advanced capitalist states of Western Europe and North America, including Australia, which make up what we know all as the West, are all racial states founded on the genocide of so-called inferior peoples, on their despoliation and exploitation. For Goldberg, race is, like class, the foundation of modern states. And as Gramsci teaches us, the capitalist state is integral in the sense that it cannot be reduced to its institutions, its police, and its bureaucracy. Political society, including left-wing parties and trade unions, as well as civil society, are an integral part of the state. On the basis of these two conceptions of the state, the racial state and the integral state, my idea of the integral racial state allows us to render moral anti-racism obsolete once and for all, because it allows us to better understand the structural and systemic nature of racism. If racism cannot be fought by a moralist method, it is because it is the product of a racial pact between the state, dominated by its bourgeoisie, political society, and civil society. In other words, while it must be acknowledged that there is a class struggle within the capitalist states, it is counter-revolutionary because the left-wing political society, which defends the interests of the proletariat, is linked to the imperialist order via an organic bond with the capitalist state. By abandoning internationalism in favor of proletarian chauvinism, the communist and trade union organizations in France have largely contributed to the constitution of the integral racial state. By accepting the sharing out of imperialist rents, first for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, but also for the benefit of the white proletariat, the organizations which claim to defend the workers have produced a counter-revolutionary class struggle. This reading applies to anti-fascism. There is a moral anti-fascism that we must fight against. This expression is used to designate a Western political system which limits fascism to the far right. In these conditions, moral anti-fascism means support for the current institutions born out of the victory of 1945, and its ultimate horizon is the elections. In the wonderful world of moral anti-fascists, since the end of the Second World War, we have been following a constant move towards progress, where the extension of the global market goes hand in hand with hopes for peace and the advancement of minority rights. The proof, if any were needed, of the absurdity of this discourse is the genocidal war still underway in Gaza, entirely made possible by Western arms supplies. First and foremost from the United States and Germany, but France, it is also taking part in it. Since October 7, the leaders of most Western liberal democracies have come out to claim Israel's right to defend itself. Entire sections of the media in these countries, and by far the majority, have put themselves at the service of Israeli propaganda. Perhaps the monstrous nature of moral anti-fascism in its final stages lie in this. It is in the name of the memory of the genocide of the Jews of Europe that the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza is justified. It is in the name of the memory of the Shoah that the capitalist West is once again assuming its genocidal face. The clash in Gaza signifies the end of moral and republican anti-fascism and lays bare the latent fascism of the French state that has never disappeared since 1945. This is why we need to replace moral anti-fascism with political anti-fascism. Consequently, to fight fascism, we need to define our main enemy, the agent of fascisation. In other words, the modern state and the bourgeois bloc. Fighting the far right is a vital duty, but concentrating all our efforts on it is a political and strategic error. I've just explained why it is a political mistake. The state is the main enemy that not only produces the far right, but also exploits it for its own ends. And worse than that, the existence of the far right is in fact the state's good conscience. It allows it to act as a shield against fascism. As the pace of privatization accelerates, as the institutions of welfare are dismantled one by one, and as the space for compromise with the bourgeoisie shrinks, the place of the far right in French politics is changing. Described as an absolute outsider to the acceptable political game, the far right in reality plays a dual role. As a purveyor of fascist ideas, its rise also justifies the introduction of racist and liberticidal measures. By paving the way for it, while constantly dissociating itself from it, the moral anti-fascism of the ruling capitalist bloc helps to ensure the spread of its ideas while giving them a subversive veneer. The far right's electoral successes that follow give the various governments the best possible excuse to implement a whole range of the far right's agenda. Since the 2004 law on the veil up to the recent one on separatism, we have been experiencing a continuing racist and authoritarian acceleration for nearly 2 decades, focused on accumulation of Islamophobic, anti-crime, and anti-terrorist laws. To this, we should add repeated dissolutions of anti-racist and Muslim organizations, the incorporation of emergency measures into common law, imperialist interventions around the world, and the warmongering of those who want to rearm us. All this is obviously fueled by far-right ideologues, but we would be fooling ourselves to make them the absolute champions of reaction. The right had no difficulty in passing the law on the veil, which was supported by a large part of the left. It was in the name of the fight against terrorism that the socialists promulgated the state of emergency, which resulted in thousands of arbitrary searches in working-class neighborhoods before having an impact on the social movement. It is the ruling bloc that promotes racism, not the far right, which has never been in power. But why is focusing the struggle on the far right a strategic error? The elites never cease to justify their racist acceleration by invoking the racism that is allegedly rife among the white working classes. It is not certain that it is as simple as that. One way of reducing the importance of this schematism is to note that there is no mass fascist movement in the country despite the racist outpouring in the media and the political class. Today's fascists differ from those of the 30s in that they are currently incapable of investing in and or competing with the social movement. We are therefore a long way from mass politics and the fear aroused by black shirts or militias capable of committing pogroms and fomenting coups. The mass nature of fascism today has more to do with the form of passive wave spread through social networks and the influence exerted by ideological apparatuses. It is therefore important and even essential to separate fascist political organizations and their activists from their voters. While there is no doubt that fascist organizations are radical enemies, the same cannot be said of their voters, who number in the millions. At the last elections, 10 million of them voted for the far right. I said earlier that racism is a joint production. The bourgeois bloc produces racism. Political society produces racism. Civil society produces racism because everyone benefits from it. But just because these 3 bodies are all interested in the racial order, it doesn't mean that each has an equivalent interest in it. For my part, I think that the 3 bodies, the bourgeois bloc, I think that of the 3 bodies, the bourgeois bloc has the greatest interest in racial division, in particular because it is a counter-revolutionary guarantee, but also because it is the bourgeoisie which draws the greatest benefit from it. Firstly, material profit. Racism is the condition for overexploitation. Non-white workers are more profitable than white workers. Secondly, political profit. The racial divide and the resulting conflict of interests between white and non-white workers prevents any form of proletarian unity. But if it's true that the white working classes benefit from racism, whiteness being a moral as well as a material wage, their interest is lower. But above all, the interest of whiteness can be replaced by the interest of popular unity. The unity of the proletariat and the white and non-white subaltern classes, in short. In short, the bourgeoisie has a total interest in maintaining the racial order, while the white workers have an important but partial interest in it. Confronted to this contradiction, the white proletariat is left with two options: fascism or revolution. It is precisely the possibility of this choice that offers a strategic opportunity. While proletarians may have an immediate interest in fascism and racial preference, but we know that they have an interest in revolution in the medium and long term, because the ruling bloc and the far right will end up betraying them simply because they will never implement a social solution and because they serve the interest of capital. That's why we urgently need to politicize anti-fascism and convince ourselves that it's possible. Indeed, the revolt of the Yellow Vests in France has shown us that this fraction of the French proletariat, despite being very strongly affected by racism, sexism, and homophobia, was not dominated by these affects at the time of this incredible insurrection. On the contrary, during their revolt, they named the government and President Macron as the main enemy. What's more, because they understood who the enemy was, the French police didn't hesitate to brutally repress them. They understood what they had in common with the blacks and Muslims of France. In short, to put it another way, the experience showed that some French proletarians were not completely prisoners of the racial state. This is a sign of great hope. That's why, even though we know the extent to which racism structures social relations in France, we also know that this is not inescapable. That's why we need an anti-fascist strategy aimed at the white working classes, who it would be foolish to abandon at a time when the fascists are going to such length to keep them on their side, particularly by fueling Islamophobic sentiment in the population. Indeed, the bourgeoisie, which has the most acute class consciousness, has no confidence in the loyalty of the white working classes. This is why Islamophobia is an indispensable tool. It allows a lasting separation between the two most important fractions of the French proletariat. We have to be clear. Good feelings are not going to save us. The white proletariat will not turn to anti-fascism naturally, or simply because fascism and racism are forms of false consciousness. They will go where they consider that their interests are being defended. That's why the radical and decolonial left must take the lead on what is identified by a large part of this proletariat as a problem. I have named the European Union. Let me explain. All the polls since 2005 showed that the French popular classes reject Europe. As it happens, it was the left that politicized the no vote in the 2005 referendum on the European Constitution. What happened? The no vote won. But the most important lesson is that this victory was made possible by left-wing and far-right voters under the leadership of the left. It is clear that it's possible to bring back far-right voters to a left-wing program. This is the kind of dynamic that needs to be put in place. But that will not be enough to develop hegemony. Before thinking about a program, we need an idea, one that will cement the unity of the popular bloc. I agree with my friends Panayotis Sotiris and Stathis Kouvelakis that it is important, even crucial, to reinvest the idea of nation, which should not be abandoned to the bourgeoisie state and the far right. We must reinvest it in the form of a national popular bloc, as Gramsci suggests, or a people's nation, as Poulantzas suggests, who explains that the nation is not simply a product or a need of the bourgeoisie, but also a product of class struggle. It is also because the nation is a popular asset that the white working classes in particular are attached to it. Admittedly, this has a reactionary dimension, but also a progressive one. Ownership of the nation is therefore a question of the balance of power, and also a question of class struggle. Throughout French history, the idea of a revolutionary homeland nation has been part of the revolutionary tradition. The bourgeois bloc and the far right ended up turning it into a racist and imperialist reference. But the story is not over. The proposal of France, of La France Insoumise, La Nouvelle France, the New France, is precisely to recover the revolutionary definition of people-nation by introducing an anti-racist social program. We must encourage this idea, which is currently only reformist, because the full sovereignty of the new people, la Nouvelle France, of France, will only be achieved if the racial pact, which, I repeat, is an organic link with the bourgeoisie, is broken. Withdrawal from Europe is a decisive step towards this break, but a return to the nation state will not be an end in itself, because we must never lose sight of the need for internationalism. To achieve this, we must continue to build this nation people by deepening class contradictions and reducing racial divisions. I don't have time to elaborate here, but it is clear that the nation people I have in mind is a new people, in the sense that it will be multicultural, multi-confessional, and internationalist. For me, there is no contradiction between being a nation people and internationalism. As everyone knows, there is nation in the word internationalism. So the real question is, what kind of people are we talking about? I'm not naive, and I know that in our context, the possibility of fascism is more than likely, because the peoples of Europe are being won over by fascism. I also know that the concepts of people and nation are fictitious. That is, in a way, they don't exist. But it is precisely because they are human inventions that utopia is possible. It is therefore up to us to invent these new peoples. Otherwise, what is the point of politics? Thank you.
I'm not going to be creepy.
No, don't worry. Yeah. Okay, I'll just give people a chance to leave. All right, so thank you so much for having me to speak today and for all the work that's gone into organizing the conference. I am going to be speaking about a research project that I've been working on since 2019 with my colleague and comrade Rafif Ziada on global dock worker solidarity with Palestine. And I'm also going to talk about some of what we've learned from supporting trade unionists around the world to take solidarity actions through the organization Workers in Palestine. And want to give a shout out to Raya Al-Sana as well, brilliant organizer from Workers in Palestine. Yeah. So in terms of what I'm speaking about today, I just want to say that I believe that there are lessons here not only for the Palestine solidarity movement, but for doing left political work more generally within unions. Working with unions, I believe, is strategically advantageous for the left, and that it opens up the possibility of moving beyond symbolic actions and street protests to maximizing economic costs for states, employers, and those who are complicit with them. Blockades by community-based activists have resulted in short delays to the shipment of arms from factories and ports. We've seen this in many countries. But it's only when workers on the inside have gotten involved directly that we've seen more lasting and significant impacts. Working in and through unions is valuable as well as a means of helping workers to question the very purpose of trade unionism in economies that rely heavily on militarism and imperialism. When organizing is effective, workers come to reevaluate their own role in war economies and to expand their horizons beyond pay and working conditions to the question of production for the social good. However, the primary argument I want to get across today is that in order to do this kind of work effectively, we must center discussions of organizing practice in our debates on organizing strategy. So overall, I'm arguing for a more humanistic approach to strategy that puts our organizing relationships at the center. Organizing relationships built on respect, trust, reciprocity, and care. Okay. So our research on international dock worker solidarity with Palestine has focused on blockade actions in ports since 2010 in a number of different countries, including the US, South Africa, and Sweden. A first paper analyzing the US cases will be available online shortly in Critical Sociology, so keep an eye out for that. So in this paper, we examine actions taken in 2014 and 2021 in the West Coast ports of Oakland, Seattle, and Long Beach, and at the East Coast port of Elizabeth in New Jersey. So organizing under the banner of Block the Boat, activists sought to prevent the Israeli company Zim from docking at US ports. Actions that have been echoed globally since 2023 in efforts to block the transportation of arms to Israel from many countries. In the US, Palestine Solidarity Movement activists developed a strategy of forming what they called community picket lines outside the terminal gates of ports to try to dissuade unionized dock workers from going into work. When picket lines were large and disruptive enough, unionized dock workers were able to invoke the health and safety clauses in their collective agreements to refuse to enter the workplace. So essentially, these were de facto work stoppages within the highly restrictive constraints of American labor law. Yet across these four port-based cases in the US, what we saw was that community activists came up against very different sets of local circumstances and that they approached their work with unions in very different ways. And both of these impacted on their success. So by far the most successful US case in the study was the Port of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. So first and most importantly, the radical and militant history and culture of the union branch, famously known as Local 10 of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, was critical. So Local 10 had an existing cadre of activist members who were able to serve as effective bridge builders with an external community-based organization, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, known as AROC. So these union bridge builders helped to advise AROC on strategy by orienting them to the shipping industry, the port's geography, and the internal politics of the union, as well as helping to smooth over tensions that developed at points between the community activists and the union. They also played a critical role in building support among union members and leaders. So following their advice, community activists decided to put off taking action by several weeks in order that they would have the time to visit the union's hiring hall on a daily basis and speak with members directly again and again about Israeli apartheid and the attacks on Gaza. They framed the action they were planning in relation to racist police violence in the US. This was an issue that the union's predominantly Black membership cared about deeply and had already taken action on in the past. And finally, the port's close proximity to the downtown area in Oakland, which is a city with a large left-wing population, made it relatively easy to mobilize thousands of supporters for community picket lines at short notice. And the unionized dock workers overwhelmingly respected the picket lines. The action in 2014 was a tremendous success. Zim not only pulled all of its business from Oakland, but pulled out of the West Coast of the United States entirely, which was a major victory for the BDS movement. AROC's careful work with the union to build mutually respectful and trusting relationships paid off in the form of a long-term and very close and reciprocal relationship with the union, which continues to this day. So while the goals were identical, the actions in Seattle, Long Beach, and Port Elizabeth were less effective than in Oakland because of a failure on the part of the community organizations to build strong relationships with the unions. In Long Beach and Port Elizabeth, the community activists were unable to identify potential bridge builders in the union. And the unions themselves didn't have the same history of radicalism as Oakland. Unlike in Oakland, these ports were located far from city centers, so it was quite difficult to mobilize community members for picket lines. Though activists planning to picket did make the effort to leaflet the workers in advance, they were not successful in building support. So what these cases really underlined was that despite the best efforts of community activists working from the outside, without the support of workers on the inside and the trade unions, it wasn't possible to take actions that resulted in anything more than short delays, very much in contrast to the Oakland action. So the action in Seattle sort of falls somewhere in between. So the Port of Seattle, like the Port of Oakland, is located just outside the center of a city with a big left-wing population. So community activists were able to mobilize large numbers of supporters at short notice. And in addition, the union had some history of radicalism and had some members who were supportive of the action. The problem was that the Seattle activists felt that they needed to act urgently, and they decided to prioritize mobilizing the community over building a strong relationship with the union. And so this resulted in major tensions between the activists and the union and a breakdown of trust, a breakdown of the relationship. And ultimately, large segments of the union were opposed to the action. So while the mobilization was successful in delaying the unloading of the Zim ship for a week, which is certainly no mean feat, it was ultimately unloaded by members of the union after the numbers on the picket line dwindled and the police came in and intervened. And so I think the lesson here, it's a bit of a counterfactual, but we can imagine that if the Seattle activists had been more successful in building a strong relationship with the union as in Oakland, they might have been able to actually prevent the ship from being worked indefinitely. So what I think the cases highlight overall is the importance of selecting targets, not simply on the basis of what will theoretically provide the most strategic leverage to the movement, but also on the basis of what's likely to succeed from an organizing perspective, which might be very different. So actions at sites where unions have little history of militancy or radicalism, where bridge builders can't be identified, are unlikely to succeed. And the same goes for sites that are difficult for community activists to access. I think that the cases also underline the importance of a certain kind of organizing practice based on the well-known principle that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, right? And going together, in this case, means taking the time to really meet union members and leaders where they're at and build durable relationships based on mutual respect, reciprocity, and trust. It also means having a clear commitment to carefully working through any tensions that arise. It's worth remembering that in organizing, as in life, it's generally much easier to break things than it is to build things. So we need to take a lot of care with the organizing relationships that we build. Critically, we need to keep in mind that ideas alone do not organize people. People organize people. And union members, like everyone else, do not respond well to feeling patronized or used by community activists operating in an extractive manner. So meeting on an equal footing with union activists means having a real willingness to listen and understand where the local union is coming from, and having the humility to revise our own assumptions and ideas about how best to organize on that basis. At the end of the day, all we really have in organizing are our relationships with one another. So we need to put them at the center of any discussion of what is to be done. I do want to acknowledge that we can answer certain questions, certain aspects of the question of what is to be done by working sort of deductively from the top down, thinking about, the organization of political economy and how that can help point us to key spaces of leverage, right? It can help us to think about the what, where, when, and why of action. But what top-down strategy can't help pinpoint is the how of organizing, which requires an intimate knowledge of the people actually involved, their experiences, their motivations, their worldviews, and so on. The how requires working inductively from the bottom up, putting aside our assumptions and coming with an openness and a humility to discovering what things are actually like within a given workplace and proceeding to build authentic organizing relationships on that basis. Unfortunately, the how of organizing is too often invisible and devalued labor on the left relative to the importance that we put on strategic analysis. But as we've seen, strategizing without the how doesn't seem to get us anywhere. So we need to get into the habit of asking ourselves again and again, not just what makes an effective strategy, but what makes an effective organizer. So in the final part of my talk today, I'm going to speak about some of the additional lessons we've learned, not just through our research, but also through our work with the organization Workers in Palestine, supporting trade unionists across a wide range of sectors and countries who have been taking solidarity actions with Palestine. So perhaps the most important lesson is that the things that make union members effective organizers for Palestine in their workplaces are the same things that make effective workplace organizers in general. So why is this an important lesson? We've found that oftentimes activists who have extensive experience doing Palestine solidarity work in the broader community have little experience participating in their own unions. And consequently, they have little experience of what it takes to be effective there. Like many activists on the left, many also carry with them quite negative or even disdainful views of unions, right? And I want to just be really clear, of course, it is critical that we have an understanding of union bureaucracy, an understanding of the limitations of trade unionism in capitalist, imperialist, militarist societies. We need to understand the complex and often troubling legacies of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so on. But to organize effectively in our unions, we can't stop there, right? Unions also have unique leverage that activists operating outside of workplaces generally lack. That is, they have the potential to take aim at the key economic structures that shape our society. If we are serious about the self-emancipation of the working class, and I hope we are, we must start from the vantage point that however flawed they may be, unions are the most powerful, actually existing organizations of workers in our society. Starting out with a disdainful attitude towards unions is unsurprisingly a poor basis for effective organizing. But I think there's some other critical shifts that experienced left-wing political activists need to make when they start organizing with unions. Jane McNally, the influential late American union organizer and writer, made a helpful distinction in this regard between issue-based organizing and place-based organizing. So we can think of Palestine solidarity work in general as an example of issue-based organizing. So this involves bringing together people who are passionate about a particular issue around a common goal. So the potential pool of activists in issue-based organizing is as large as the society itself, and activism focuses primarily on mobilizing members of this group. Now, place-based organizing is different. The pool of potential activists here is much smaller, and in a workplace, it consists solely of the people in that workplace. So the likelihood of finding large numbers of people who are already passionately committed to a non-workplace issue is smaller. So in that situation, rather than relying on finding people who already share our view, place-based organizing requires spending a much more time organizing rather than mobilizing, as David said earlier, right? So that is to say, we need to spend our time not getting ready to do the big event, but most of the time is spent just speaking with coworkers, convincing them to support our aims, right? And as a quick aside, I just want to be clear here that we're not talking generally about doing battle in unions and workplaces with Zionists. That's not the major issue that we've found with the trade unionists, what we've worked with. What the main challenge they've identified isn't Zionists and unions, it's the competing priorities, disempowerment, and apathy of members. So that's really the terrain here. So the work of organizing then is the work of convincing coworkers that Palestine should be a priority and that they have the ability to make a meaningful contribution through taking collective action. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the people who are best positioned to do this work are people who already have extensive experience organizing within their unions and who are liked, trusted, and respected by their coworkers. So building relationships with seasoned union activists, if you're new to this kind of work in a union, is a crucial starting point. What seasoned activists are able to impart is a sense of how the language, culture, and approach to effective organizing in unions differs from the language, culture, and approach to effective organizing in the broader community. Because the Palestine Solidarity Movement, like many movements on the left, has had a strong mooring in universities, it can be difficult to see the ways in which it can carry class-based norms that might be quite off-putting outside of universities. So for example, in universities and student politics, there's often a strong emphasis on the politics of language, which can be really alienating for people who don't share this framework. So if we're thinking about working in a union, using academic terms like settler colonialism is likely to communicate the unhelpful message that in order to be an effective activist for Palestine, you need to be an expert. So instead, what we found is it's much more helpful to simply explain these concepts in clear, jargon-free, everyday language. So not watering down the message, but communicating it in a way that is appropriate for the audience. So even more importantly, I would argue, than providing the most sort of on-point analysis is the ability of union activists to speak sincerely and from the heart about why they personally are moved on this issue. So vivid examples that put the focus on concrete human experience and illustrate broader principles keep people engaged. When this is coupled with clearly made linkages to the complicity of states and employers and parallels to experiences closer to home, we see union members move to take action. We also need to be willing to engage in ongoing self-reflection about how we relate to our coworkers who are not yet committed activists. Nobody likes to feel patronized, and people tend to respond to genuinely two-way conversations where they feel heard and respected. Trust and reciprocity are at the heart of building effective organizing communities, and they're built by our actions even more than our words. Are we approaching coworkers with openness and flexibility to really hear their concerns and find the answers together? Or are we showing up with a pre-existing plan thinking we alone know best? When tensions arise, do we take the time to work through them with care and humility, or do we write people off? And are we helping others to develop as leaders, or are we hogging the spotlight? I think that these are critical questions for all organizers, yet unfortunately, they often tend to be at the periphery of discussions of left strategy. We are facing so many dire challenges in the world today, from the genocide in Gaza to the global rise of the far right to the climate crisis and so much more. It's not enough to simply develop a good strategic analysis of these issues if that analysis doesn't put organizing practice at its core. This means centering human relationships as the foundation of all organizing, rather than relying simply on good ideas to carry the day. Thank you very much.
Okay, comrades, First things first, Samir Gandesha has left his glasses, so if he is here, can he get it, or can someone tell him? Secondly, it's been a very long, very productive conference, so we're going to call it to a conclusion here, so we can all leave in good time. I want us to thank once again our excellent speakers, who I think was a great set of speeches. I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank everyone who's contributed to organizing this conference. I'll see you again in a year's time, and probably see you in 7,000 other conferences in different places in the interim. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Oh, and if you just can't get enough, we will be at the Marlborough Arms, continuing the 8 Gym experience as we always do.